Greetings, everyone. In this recording, I'm going to be sharing some information along with some of my perspectives on this election and the choice that we face on this ballot. I know it's super close to Election Day and many have already voted and most are already decided, but I think this info will be helpful after the election too for people to understand why others voted a certain way. And I'll be sharing a lot of information and data on many different topics that will be useful for people as we move forward, regardless of the election or its outcome. Even if you consider yourself politically savvy and knowledgeable, you will very likely still hear some new info that will be useful in your discussions and debates. And if this webcast can help, even just one or two voters out there still trying to make a decision, or convince one or two people into changing their minds or changing their votes, which can be done in a number of states, then it'll also be worth it. So if you find this webcast informative and helpful, please do share it with anyone who may be somewhat on the fence and may also be open-minded enough to check out information they may not have been otherwise exposed to. Just a little bit about me. I'm basically an old school liberal, hippie, anti-war, anti-interventionist, anti-drug war, pro-environment, pro-free speech, and pro-freedom in general. Born and raised in New York City, also lived in Santa Cruz, Berkeley, and Oakland. I have a lifelong passionate interest in psychedelics, psychedelic counterculture, and shamanism. And so I led a very bohemian-style life, but I also have a very healthy respect for traditionalism and recognize its value in maintaining a civilization. So a lot of people are now waking up to the fact that this competition between two candidates is a bit more complex than how it is presented by the likes of mainstream news or pop culture celebrities. So I'm going to go over some of the major issues and how each candidate fares on them. These issues will include war and foreign policy, government authoritarianism, the drug war, healthcare and big pharma, the question of which candidate represents and is supported by wealthy elites versus the working class and how so, the economy in general, the ecological environment, race and racism, LGBT issues and civil rights, and then I'll address some character issues such as sexual assault allegations, lies told by each of the candidates and lies about them, allegations of corruption and nepotism, and then I'll address some further matters of Trump's record and some of the popular concerns and criticisms of him, such as family separation at the border and his handling of the pandemic. Now, I could easily speak for 3 hours on each one of those topics, but to make this recording as concise as I possibly can and just to get it out there, I'll only spend about 2 to 10 minutes on each topic. So there is so much more to be said on every topic, as there are many details and nuances to many of the points I'll be raising that I will just have to leave out for the sake of time, but I do plan on expanding on these issues and many, many others in future videos to address the common arguments and counter-arguments that I may have left out of this recording. And while this is just an audio recording, in the future I plan to upload videos that'll be edited with images of sources, citations, headlines, video clips, and an abundance of relevant and highly dank memes. But I decided I just want to get this information out there before the election, so this will just be an audio presentation. You can listen to it while you clean the house or commute to work, or sit down and have a cup of tea with me and enjoy. So let's start with the first topic, foreign policy and war. A very important issue to me, as I hope it is for you too. And let's start with Biden on this one. We got to look at and consider their records. And Biden's record is that he voted for and supported every war of the past 47 years. And he didn't just vote for the Iraq War, he was promoting an Iraq invasion in 1997, even before 9/11 was used as a justification. And he was not only just a voter of the Iraq War, but a key element in its planning and building support for the war. He was one of those who said we would be, quote, greeted as liberators. He teamed up with the warmonger John McCain in striking down approval requirements from the UN Security Council for Bush to go to war. Former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates has said that Joe Biden has, quote, been wrong on every major foreign policy and national security issue for the past 4 decades, which is quite a statement. And if you think he's suddenly a changed man, you might want to think again. This year on his campaign, he's repeatedly said that he wants to keep troops in the Middle East, that he wants Susan Rice for his Secretary of State, Michelle Flournoy for Secretary of Defense, both of whom are total warmongers. Flournoy guided the foreign intervention policies of both Bush and Obama administrations, pushing for preemptive strikes and interventions. And essentially all the Republicans who are neocons and warmongers support and campaign for Joe Biden. Bill Kristol, Paul Wolfowitz, David Krugman, David Frum, Rick Wilson, John Bolton, and all the other neocon warmongers, along with most of the Bush administration officials, such as Colin Powell, who got us into Iraq with the weapons of mass destruction yellow cake lie, have all publicly endorsed Biden. So if you do consider yourself anti-war, you probably should, stop and ask yourself why this is. So with regards to Trump, again, it's important that we look at their records if you're taking the issue of war seriously. When voicing his opposition to foreign invasions during his campaign rallies, Trump not only points out how badly it hurts our economy and the tragedy, of course, of losing our own brave soldiers for vague and undefined causes, but he also brings up the massive death toll of foreign civilians, mentioning the, quote, millions of lives lost in these foreign nations, which is actually a pretty rare expression of empathy for a politician. He is the first president to name the, quote, military-industrial complex, unquote, since Eisenhower. And to me, that's actually pretty significant. And of course, he is the first president in 40 years not to start any new wars or new ground invasions. He successfully ended the Syrian war and withdrew the troops from there. Yes, his generals continued to drop bombs on Afghanistan, which is perhaps not ideal, but notice we don't constantly hear about children, weddings, and schools being bombed as we did in the previous administrations. And we actually haven't lost a single U.S. troop in Afghanistan since, I believe, February of this year, probably as the offensive has wound down and, perhaps become more strategic. And to his credit, he did negotiate the Taliban peace agreement and has been fighting Congress, mostly Democrats, but also Republicans, to end the Afghan war, and has already withdrawn as many troops as he could, and actually says he thinks he can get them all out by this Christmas. Of course, assuming he wins the election. He also withdrew most troops from Iraq and continues working to get the rest out. And there's a lot of positive progress being made by this president on various fronts, actually. He's currently negotiating the Israel-Lebanon peace arrangement over their border dispute. He's negotiated a major Balkans peace deal between Serbia and Kosovo after a serious 21-year-long conflict, which is huge. And he also negotiated the Kurds-Turks ceasefire. He recently negotiated peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan. He's negotiated, I believe, 6 peace deals in total so far in the Middle East, just in the past 2 months alone, when there hasn't been any before that in decades. And many more are expected to follow in the coming months. Again, presuming he is reelected. So we're literally seeing peace finally break out in the Middle East after so many decades of really horrific conflict. And for these various peace deals, he has received 5 nominations so far for the Nobel Peace Prize and will probably continue to receive more. And due to Trump's policies, the U.S. is also now energy independent, meaning wars for foreign oil is no longer an excuse. Most also don't realize how serious of a situation North Korea was when Trump took office. Obama correctly said it was the most important issue. And according to the leaders of South Korea, Japan, and other nations, Trump deserves the credit for solving it and avoiding a catastrophe of truly historic proportions that seemed almost certain just 4 years ago. Achieving peace in Korea after 70 years is definitely a historic accomplishment for peace that I think any real anti-war peace activist should be singing praises of. He has also secured freedom for 55 American captives and hostages of foreign hostile states, which is, I believe, an order of magnitude more than any previous president in recent history. And he got them returned from other countries without paying a single cent, as previous administrations did, including hostages returned from North Korea. And he has finally withdrawn troops from Germany. ISIS was also completely wiped out and defeated in less than a year when Obama said it would take generations, and this in turn has led to a decrease in the number of terror attacks globally. Trump also ended the covert CIA funding of and providing weapons to ISIS terrorists 6 months into his presidency, which was very underappreciated how significant that was, although Tulsi Gabbard did praise the action as she had previously submitted her Stop Arming Terrorists Act, which aimed to do the same, but her bill sadly garnered only 13 supporters. But nonetheless, Trump got it done. And President Trump, also got the rest of NATO to finally start paying their share, adding $100 billion to the NATO alliance. And in that regard and in others, he actually has been tougher on Russia than any other recent administration, giving the Ukrainians tank busters and other weapons instead of just blankets, as Obama-Biden did, as just one of a few examples. So Trump has campaigned on ending war since 2015, and he continued to normalize this rhetoric among right-wing political discourse, which itself is a major accomplishment. Unfortunately, while the left Democrats are still majority pro-war and intervention, and this is actually true of the left in general, not just Democrat leadership. Polls conducted by the Huffington Post and others found that only 26% of Clinton voters supported withdrawing troops from Syria, while 76% of Trump voters supported the withdrawal. And only 37% of Democrats were in favor of withdrawal from Afghanistan, while 81% of Trump voters support troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. So again, if you consider yourself anti-war or anti-interventionist, please take a good moment to contemplate those numbers and which side you choose to align yourself with and support. Trump may not be as perfectly and idealistically anti-war as some of us may wish, but there really is no comparison when it comes to other major politicians, let alone Biden, who voted for Iraq war and every other war in recent history, and also likes to brag about authoring the Patriot Act. And so, speaking of the Patriot Act, let's now shift to the topic of government authoritarianism. Starting with Trump, he actually does have the most transparent administration ever, and he's definitely also the most libertarian president in modern history. I can make a separate video illustrating all the ways that is true in terms of literally shrinking government in many various and specific ways. Trump has pushed the audit of the Pentagon, which has been constantly losing track of trillions of dollars over the past 2 decades, which is pretty sketchy, to say the least. And he has also been continually supportive of auditing the Federal Reserve and has drawn much needed scrutiny and criticism of the Fed, not such as we've seen since JFK. And he's enacted historic deregulation, freeing up small business growth and economic progress by getting the government and bureaucracy off of the backs of entrepreneurs. So, less controlling. Trump also has expressed that he is open to pardoning Edward Snowden, while Biden said Snowden deserves severe punishment and wants to punish any other nations that provide him asylum. Actually, Biden himself called all 27 countries that Snowden applied for asylum in and threatened them with consequences enough to make them deny him asylum, with the exception of Russia. And again, Biden brags about being the author of the Patriot Act, which included sweeping surveillance capabilities and allowed the federal government to carry out criminal prosecutions based on secret evidence and detain American citizens indefinitely without due process. And for years, it was Biden who led the charge to militarize the police. And the Patriot Act granted him many of those wishes. With all of this focus and energy behind defunding or at least reforming the police, people are neglecting that it is actually Joe Biden who spent his career pushing for this militarization. And, he boasts about having his name on every single draconian crime bill, which I'll get into more next when discussing the drug war. He was also the architect of civil asset forfeitures. And his 91 crime bill added 60 crimes to be eligible for the death penalty and increased penalties on 70 more crimes. That was, what he pushed for and celebrated. And even today, he's campaigning on more mask mandates, continued lockdowns of the economy, businesses, schools, churches, gyms. He claims to, quote, follow the science, but it's now clear that the general lockdowns, as opposed to targeted quarantines, are simply not supported by science as being an effective measure against the spread. And if Biden and the Democrats gain control, it's quite clear at this point that flagrant, widespread censorship will become completely out of control. Freedom of speech will be very quickly eroded and eventually abolished, which sadly will satisfy many modern leftists who now actively and openly campaign against the First Amendment, which is bizarre to me, but I guess we're just getting used to it at this point. And, of course, the Democrats do also want to abolish the right to self-defense, particularly against government tyranny, which is the sole reason for the Second Amendment. I've personally never been a gun guy, but if you like your right to self-defense, please go to the Biden campaign's website and look at his policies regarding gun control and the Second Amendment. It's really extreme. It's mind-boggling extreme. And he's also said he'll put beta. Hell yeah, we're coming for your AR-15s, O'Rourke, in charge of gun policy, which is really rather terrifying, even for moderates on the issue. So, yeah, the issue of authoritarianism is actually a pretty big one, and there's lots and lots of facets we could explore among both the Trump administration and the potential Biden-Harris administration, and of course with regards to the current Democrat Party in general. But I'll leave it there for now and move on to the next topic, which is related, being the drug war. So, as I mentioned, I was for many, many years quite the psychedelics advocate and participated in drug policy reform activism. So this is another issue that I do still care quite a bit about. I think locking up peaceful, kind, productive citizens for simple drug infractions, especially those involving cannabis or psychedelics, is itself a heinous and violent crime. So Trump has said since day one of his first campaign that he would approve any cannabis decriminalization legislation that came to him. It is unfortunate that it has taken Congress so long, but with changing public perception, I'm sure some bill will be put to vote soon, hopefully sooner than later. And all of the decriminalization bills currently being put forth are bipartisan, written and submitted by both Democrats and Republicans. So the issue is hardly partisan anymore. So we can't really put the blame at the feet of just the Republicans as we more easily could in previous decades. And to his credit on this issue, Trump has hardly enforced federal laws by cracking down on grow-ops, unlike the Obama administration did with his intense multi-year-long rash of federal raids against growers. I mean, I don't know if people remember that. He lightened up in his second term, but his first term was very extreme. And of course, Trump did legalize hemp and CBD, both of which were long-awaited and significant steps in the right direction. And Trump has been releasing thousands of non-violent drug offenders through his First Step Act, who were locked up for decades due specifically to Joe Biden's crime bill. So Trump's major criminal justice reforms have also had a big impact on the drug war. Harris-Biden, they say they're in favor of legalization now, but both have the worst histories imaginable on the issue. Biden is the biggest drug warmonger of the past 30 years, the author of many crime bills, including the '94 crime bill atrocity, with the mandatory minimum sentences, raised maximum sentences, civil asset forfeiture, 3 strikes rule, and the crack cocaine disparity, with 5 grams of crack carrying the same sentence as 500 grams of cocaine. He himself is responsible for the mass incarceration of tens of thousands of nonviolent, mostly black, drug offenders, who Trump is now setting free. Biden himself has said, quote, "Every major crime bill and every minor crime bill since 1976 has had my name on it," he said braggingly. Biden openly complained that the Bush seniors' war on drugs was not nearly tough enough. He continued pushing to create the office of the drug czar after Reagan vetoed his first attempt. And in 2002, he introduced the RAVE Act, the Reducing Americans' Vulnerability to Ecstasy Act, which not only increased penalties for drug crimes, but also criminalized anyone who owned the property where a rave was held, as well as the promoters of the events, sending them to prison and, criminalizing raves themselves, essentially. And, one really ugly hypocrisy of it all is that while Biden was having people locked up for decades for possessing small amounts of crack cocaine, he was covering for his son's lifelong crack habit, and later, as vice president, essentially helped him avoid jail despite being arrested for crack possession. So, that's just one of those rules for me, but not for thee hypocrisies that is really gross, and in this case, was connected to the destruction of so many lives. And then we have Kamala Harris, who likes to call herself the top cop, and not long ago gave thousands of nonviolent, small-amount cannabis possession offenders very long sentences in prison. And, just as a lifelong anti-drug war advocate and activist, it is really hard to imagine voting for this pair in particular. Okay, for the next issue, let's talk about healthcare and Big Pharma. Obviously, the healthcare issue is a big and complicated one in regards to the partisan political debates surrounding it. So I'm not going to get into the pros and cons of public options, socialization, privatization, and so on. But I will run through some important points to help assess how the Trump administration has been doing with regards to healthcare costs compared to the Obama, Biden, and other previous administrations. So first basic fact. Drug prices skyrocketed under Obama and his ACA, but have fallen dramatically under Trump. Drug prices actually fell for the first time in over 50 years under Trump. And this past year, many different kinds of medications, from insulin to inhalers to heart medicine to antibiotics and many others, actually fell in price drastically by 50 to 90% cheaper, or even more. There was this wave of people who didn't realize what was happening on Twitter, tweeting about how all of a sudden their pharmaceuticals had dropped to a tiny fraction of what they were before, not realizing that this has been due to executive orders to lower U.S. drug prices to the same as other nations, as well as allowing the import of cheaper drugs. Trump also enforced the FDA to approve more affordable generic drugs than ever before in history, which led also to many drug companies freezing or reversing planned price increases. And Trump signed a law ending the gag orders on pharmacists that prevented them from sharing money-saving information. He reformed Medicare programs to stop hospitals from overcharging low-income seniors on their drugs, saving seniors hundreds of millions of dollars per year. He implemented executive orders to make hospital pricing transparent and thereby lowering prices of procedures and drugs. Under Obama, deductibles went up and premiums more than doubled, while premiums went down under Trump. Choice went down under Obama severely and went up dramatically under Trump. And Trump pretty much came up with and then signed the Right to Try Act, a beautiful piece of legislation that allows terminally ill people to try experimental drugs. And it has been saving lives. You can read and hear many testimonies online. He also signed an executive order to transform kidney care and increase transplants, which is estimated to save up to 43,000 lives per year. I'm going to have to make another video just to list and explain all of the dozens of ways that the Trump administration has successfully been fighting Big Pharma since day one, who are a much larger and more powerful industry than the energy sector or big oil. Suffice it to say, there is a reason pharmaceutical industry donations were 4 times higher for Biden than for Trump, and a reason Big Pharma runs constant attack ads against Trump on TV. And with regards to Biden, he talked about stopping Big Pharma from increasing prices further, but not lowering them to levels other countries pay, as Trump has accomplished. He sided with Big Pharma, too, against affordable COVID vaccines, and he basically has a very long history of supporting policies benefiting Big Pharma, which, again, is why they support him and attack Trump. So I'll move on now to this next issue, which is also really important one, especially since I do see many people are still quite misinformed and confused about the facts surrounding this topic, and that is how much one candidate or one party versus the other represents, or that is to say supports and is supported by, the working class versus the wealthy elites or the top 0.1%. It's really common for people to just assume that Trump and Republicans represent the wealthiest 1%, while Biden and Democrats represent the low-income, middle, and working-class folk. But when we look at the actual data, that assumption becomes much less grounded. And keep in mind that Trump's Republican populism is quite different from the establishment Republicans of previous decades. And this is true also of the new right-wing populism and economic nationalism movements we see emerging in nations around the world these days. So consider, please, with an open and inquisitive mind, the following information and think about how it fits with the conventional narratives. So the question is, which candidate represents and is supported by wealthy elites versus the working class? It was reported last election cycle that billionaires donated to Hillary Clinton in 2016 by a factor of 20 to 1 over Donald Trump. And now, by the looks of recent New York Times data, Biden by an even greater factor. Wall Street executives have donated 6 times more to Biden than to Trump. MSNBC was actually bragging about this the other day. And Trump gets far more small donations from working class and low-income voters than Biden, and Biden gets far more large-size donations than Trump. Overall, those who make over $100,000 have donated 4 times as much to Biden than to Trump, while Trump has received much more donation money from those making less than $100,000 a year. Biden, he said recently, this election is between Scranton and Park Avenue. However, Biden raised over $1 million from donors living on Park Avenue, according to FEC filings, which is more than 8 times the amount raised by the Trump campaign from the same area. And Trump actually raised more from Scranton than from Park Avenue. And for the 2020 primaries this year, the top 3 Democrat donors gave as much to Democrats as the top 39 did to Republicans. 8 of the 10 wealthiest congresspeople are Democrats. 16 of the top 20 wealthiest people in the nation are Democrats, and 9 of the top 10 wealthiest individuals donated to Democrats in 2016. Democrats hold all of the top 20 wealthiest congressional districts, and 96% of the wealthiest county in the U.S., Washington, D.C., votes Democrat. Why Washington, D.C. is the wealthiest county is a very good question to ask. What industry is it they're getting wealthy off of? I guess it's government, lobbyists and cronies and such. And also, the largest mega corporate industries are on the Democrat and anti-Trump side and donate to Democrats and Biden in roughly the following ways. 95% of multi-trillion-dollar big tech, the biggest corporations in history by far, donate to Democrat. 97% of the trillion-dollar corporate mainstream news media industry, and both big tech and mainstream news clearly leverage their power over information to benefit one candidate over another. And again, you have the vast majority of Washington, D.C. lobbyists, nearly like 97%, I think it was, of Hollywood and entertainment elites and mega millionaires donate support the Democrats and Biden. 93% of elite ivory tower academia, and again, big pharma, which again is way larger and more powerful than the energy sector. And not only do they majority support Democrats and Biden, but they also spend money on ads against Trump. And it's actually not all industries give more to Democrats, though. Some industries that tend to represent workers and laborers, such as farming and agribusiness, construction, transportation, trucking industries, they do give more to Trump and Republicans. A recent poll from Farm Journal magazine found that 85% of farmers support Trump, while only 12% support Biden. 10 million people who, I think it was 10 million or 8 million people who voted Obama, voted for Trump, with huge amounts of defectors in the Rust Belt. And I think it was 15 to 20% of Bernie supporters in 2016 ended up voting Trump. Trump's base is the working class, the proletariat, if you will. The wealthy elites, the bourgeois, and global corporatist class are the ones funding and supporting modern Democrats, Biden, and the anti-Trump agenda. So why is this, one might ask? How has the Trump administration benefited the working class and lower to middle income demographics? The left and the Occupy Wall Street people often complain, and rightfully so, about income inequality and the so-called wealth gap. For the first time in generations, under Trump's economy, income inequality actually decreased. the net worth of the bottom 50% of wage earners increased 3 times faster than for the top 1%. In the first couple years of the Trump administration, 4.2 million Americans were lifted out of poverty, with 7 million lifted off of food stamps, voluntarily stopped requesting them. The annual income of average income earners rose by $5,000, and that was at a rate over 15 times faster during Trump than the previous 2 administrations. The tax cuts, which detractors say were just for the rich, actually gave an average $2,500 a year extra to the average income family. And the corporate business tax cuts not only led to more jobs and higher wages, but also big increases in things like Christmas bonuses. And the amount people saved on lower gas and energy due to Trump getting us to become energy independent nation adds up to another $1,500 per year average. All of these factors together add up to an extra $8,000 to $10,000 per year in the pockets of average working families. That is a huge deal for middle-income families. And there's also the child tax credit, which doubled in 2019 alone. Child tax credits put over $2,000 in the pockets of 40 million American families, and not one Democrat voted in favor of that. We also had the largest ever increase in child care funding, giving nearly 1 million low-income families more affordable child care. He also instituted the first ever national paid leave tax credit. 8 million more American mothers have access to this benefit now. And manufacturing was brought back home big time. And this is still just getting started, as the USMCA and other renegotiated trade deals were just kicking in this past year. Under Obama and Biden, more than 300,000 manufacturing jobs were lost, and we were told they could never come back without some sort of, quote, magic wand. Since Trump took office, we have added more than 600,000 manufacturing jobs, and the numbers are still growing. American steel was resurrected, and hundreds of billions of dollars have been repatriated as thousands of plants and factories have moved back home and continue to. Jobless claims dropped to 50-year lows. Black, Hispanic, and Asian unemployment and poverty levels reached the lowest in recorded history. Female unemployment lowest in 74 years, and in fact women filled 65% of all the new jobs created. Veteran unemployment, disabled unemployment, employment for those without a high school diploma, and even youth unemployment all fell to all-time historic lows. So this is, again, the low and middle income demographics, the working class. This is what we're talking about, not just the top 1% or even the top 10%. Overall, so far, 7 million new jobs have been created. For the first time in U.S. history, we had more jobs offered in this country than jobs being sought. And the U.S. became the fastest developing country on the planet. I already mentioned that paychecks went up, with the average household seeing their income go up by $5,000, and that wages rose faster than any point in the previous 14 years, and rose the fastest among low-income workers. But also blue-collar jobs grew the fastest rate in more than 3 decades. Various programs to benefit workers and students in job training and apprenticeships have been implemented. Retail sales surged. New businesses went up by as much as 25% in many states. Over $10 trillion was added to the U.S. economy. Record high stock markets with $7 trillion added to the market cap. Some people think, oh, well, the record-breaking stock market only benefits the rich, which is totally untrue, as not only does it translate to more jobs and better wages and salaries, but it also benefits I think it's 50% of Americans with 401ks. And during the first 2 years of the Trump administration, $12 trillion worth was added to these 401ks. Pension fund values went up $2 trillion, and the economic optimism index and consumer confidence immediately reached 17-year highs right after the election, and still continued to climb despite the pandemic and lockdowns. Small business confidence reached the highest in history. Some keep saying that this roaring economy was merely due to Obama's policies. Yet Obama himself said that sub 2% GDP and 7% unemployment were the, quote, new norm, and that 3% GDP was impossible. But the U.S. broke through 3% within the first 6 months of Trump's administration. And even more significant measure of economic health, the GDP to debt ratio, was lowered for the first time in 50 years. Paul Krugman and all the mainstream Obama-Clinton supporting Keynesian economists and news outlets predicted a severe economic downturn or even a crash when Trump would take over following the 8 years of Obama's stagnation and anemic growth. And yes, the economy did improve during Obama's administration following the '08 crash, but it was the slowest recovery in U.S. history. Despite the fact that Obama dealt with 0% interest rates and poured $10 trillion of borrowed Fed money into the economy, doubling the national debt in a single presidency, yet the rapid and substantial economic growth that took place under the Trump administration occurred with no quantitative easing, actually with quantitative tightening, with $400 billion of liquidity removed from the market, and the Fed hiking up the interest rates. And, there's plenty of graphs and metrics that show the economic trajectories taking a sudden turn for the better and more accelerated growth as soon as Trump was elected, and again after he took office and began implementing his various policies. You may argue with, specific numbers I mentioned, but it is inarguable that the economy soared, and it was directly due to Trump's actions, such as the biggest tax cuts in U.S. history, more deregulation and cutting of bureaucratic red tape in the first 10 months than any president during their full 8-year term, and renegotiations of various economy-killing global trade deals. NAFTA, Obama-Biden's TPP, and many other unfair trade agreements have been terminated or renegotiated, just as many progressives and the working class wanted for decades. And, this also is why we saw the 15 or 20% of Bernie voters and so many Obama voters vote for Trump. And they were happy with the results, so they're probably going to vote for him again. He even got the EU to agree to work towards zero tariffs and zero non-tariff barriers and zero subsidies. No one seriously denies that the Trump economy up to the pandemic was incredible, although some awkwardly and incorrectly try to credit Obama-Biden policies. So let's consider Biden on the economy. Joe Biden supported and pushed and voted for all of the worst trade deals that transferred manufacturing and other jobs to China and India and Mexico and elsewhere. And he wants to go back to those globalist job-killing trade deals and implement even worse ones, probably. His platform currently includes big portions of the Green New Deal, which they admit will cost trillions of dollars up front, but what they don't discuss is the many, many, many trillions in downstream costs and lost revenues, and how applying such brute force to the energy sector, along with many other industries described in the plan, will affect every other industry and aspect of the economy. The cost of gas quadrupling doesn't just hurt the pockets of commuters, but also the transportation of goods and production of materials, raising the cost of nearly all other consumer products. The colossal regulatory burdens, while something megacorporations can more easily surmount, will devastate smaller and more local businesses and startups. Like the other topics being discussed in this recording, this really deserves a couple hours to examine and dissect and explain and understand. But suffice it to say, it is not hyperbolic to say that these plans will directly lead to the worst depression in U.S. history, if not a catastrophic economic collapse, dwarfing even that which crushed Venezuela. Biden also wants to eliminate the corporate tax cuts, which is one of the main reasons why so many businesses, factories, and industries have begun repatriating under Trump, bringing millions of jobs with them and allowing them to offer higher wages and salaries. The Trump tax cuts, as I just discussed, also benefited middle and working class significantly, so abolishing them will directly increase cost of living and also raise middle class taxes. And Biden also campaigns on more further lockdowns, which have already destroyed 30% of small businesses, 50% of minority-run small businesses, shuttered permanently, while at the same time dramatically enriching the big box stores, Amazon, and other multinational corporate giants. Aside from just the Green New Deal agenda, Biden wants to increase regulations and centralize government control in general, further crippling economic growth and therefore increasing cost of living, increasing unemployment, decreasing salaries, and harming smaller businesses while benefiting the larger corporate conglomerates with their large teams of lawyers and lobbyists. Almost every feature of Biden's economic plan is basically a recipe for total unmitigated disaster for the working class and the middle to low income brackets while benefiting the top 0.1%. I'll move on now to the topic of the environment. So, I'm a lifelong psychedelic hippie who has worked in horticulture and environmental activism, and as someone with a lifelong interest in shamanism and nature-based spiritual practices, have always loved revering and communicating with nature. So what I'm saying is that I care very deeply and profoundly about the ecological environment and always have, which is why it is so frustrating to see such a noble and important cause as ecological conservation and environmentalism co-opted and exploited by nefarious agendas for corporate and political power and control. The issue of environmentalism with regards to water and air pollution and ecological conservation is one matter, and rising CO2 emissions and global warming is a distinctly other matter. They are obviously related in some ways, but it is also important that they are differentiated. And in any case, both matters of environmental pollution and CO2-driven global warming are much more complicated than propagandists on either side like to claim. So I'll discuss these matters in more depth another time, but for now I'll mention a few key points that many are certainly not aware of, but should be. First off, I have to say that President Trump getting us out of the Paris Climate Accords was a very good thing. The Paris Climate Accord is nothing but a multi-trillion-dollar slush fund. It's totally unregulated and there's no audit, and it would have cost us trillions of dollars in the long run. And, it wasn't needed anyway, as CO2 levels produced by the U.S. have actually been lowered more than 3% since Trump took office, while they rose 2% in France and 1.5% in the EU as a whole. The rate of CO2 emissions in the U.S. has declined more under Trump than under Obama's administration. And likewise, toxic air and water pollution has also decreased under Trump, giving us the cleanest air and water that we've had in generations. Also, ozone production is down 10%, and very importantly, 10 times as many Superfund sites were cleaned up in President Trump's first year than in the preceding 10 years under Obama and Bush. I'm going to repeat that. 10 times as many Superfund sites, not Superfund, Superfund sites were cleaned up in President Trump's first year than in the preceding 10 years under Obama and Bush. A very serious environmental concern is the pollution in the oceans. You heard of the garbage continent and things like this. Well, Trump has signed a major historic ocean cleanup legislation, the Save Our Seas Act of 2018. He also signed the country's largest wilderness preservation legislation in over a decade, designating 375,000 new acres of protected land and creating 5 new natural monuments. He also signed the Great American Outdoors Act, which allocated $900 million per year to the Land and Water Conservation Fund and provides up to $9.5 billion over 5 years to begin clearing up a maintenance backlog at national parks. And there have been many other positive accomplishments in the area of environmental protection and conservation that I'd love to review another time. And while there are perhaps, some areas of the Trump administration's actions relative to the environment worthy of valid criticism or at least debate, most of the criticisms out there are highly misinformed or lacking crucial greater context. And overall, his administration has done more for conserving and protecting nature and national parks than pretty much any president since Teddy Roosevelt. An extremely important thing to consider when looking at policies and how they affect the environment is the fact that the more prosperous and wealthy a nation is, the less pollution it generates and the more conservation and environmental care takes place. This is just common sense if you think about it, as when a person's income passes a certain threshold, they begin to care about and act upon environmental matters more. A person struggling to survive and feed their family does not have the time or mental bandwidth to become concerned over the habitat of the yellow-headed brushfinch, for instance. So one of the problems with a Biden administration for the environment is that entering a depression or collapsing the economy with trillions of Green New Deal spending and unprecedented regulations and restrictions on top of Paris Accord regulations, which he demands we re-enter, will inevitably have many downstream negative effects on the environment. And many of the political actions taken in the name of environmentalism, regardless of how well-intentioned they may be, often lead to much, much worse outcomes, as can be seen in California with incredibly disruptive and dangerous rolling blackouts and the massively destructive and deadly fires, which have emitted more CO2 themselves than all man-made emissions on Earth for a year. All right, I'll move on to the next issue here, which will be racism. Now, Joe Biden basically started his political career as a segregationist and said he didn't want to integrate schools because he didn't want his children, quote, growing up in a racial jungle, unquote. And he fought against school integration, and he worked with and supported and was supported by openly racist segregationist Democrats and continued to work for decades with 2 of the most notorious racists in government, Strom Thurmond and the KKK Grand Cyclops Robert Byrd, who was also a very close lifelong friend of his and for whom he gave a eulogy for just a few years ago. And Biden has, a lifetime of rather offensive racist statements. Even recently, just telling millions of black Americans to their faces they were not black if they did not support him, and that the black community was not diverse. None of the statements made by Trump that people construe as racist or racially insensitive are anything near as blatant and offensive as Biden's. The 2 or 3 statements that are used to portray Trump's racism against Hispanics are taken completely out of context, such as saying that some of the people crossing the border illegally are rapists and murderers, which is obviously true, and editing it to sound like he was referring to all Hispanics, or when he called MS-13 gang members who brutally rape and then slowly torture to death innocent young women animals. The media and politicians like Pelosi spread the lie that he was referring to all migrants. And the claim that Trump is racist towards blacks is also completely fabricated with no actual evidence to support it. I mean, there's like these 2 examples from his past years ago that they try to bring up, but they really don't hold water and they involve a lot of assumptions. When Joe Biden was saying the N-word on the House floor, working with segregationist racists, writing bills that would lock up tens of thousands of nonviolent black men and women, Trump was winning the Ellis Island Award for Tolerance, Brotherhood, and Diversity alongside Muhammad Ali and Rosa Parks, who we referred to as a hero for many years. The award was for honoring how much help he gave to disadvantaged black communities. No one has ever found a single instance of Trump saying a disparaging comment about someone's race throughout his entire life, and boy, you know they have looked closely. Martin Luther King's niece, Alveda King, has worked with Trump for many years, and she never heard him say anything racist. Trump had a black girlfriend for a couple years in the 90s, and she said she never heard him say anything racist. In 1999, he wanted to run for president with an African-American woman as his running mate. Trump was a major celebrity and scrutinized public figure for decades, and no one called him racist until he decided to run for president. He was mentioned positively in over 50 rap songs over the years, and none of those black rappers ever thought he was racist until he decided to run for president. And why would Trump, if he is actually a racist, sue Palm Beach for discriminating against Jews and African Americans in their clubs? He even sent every member of the town council copies of 2 classic movies about discrimination: A Gentleman's Agreement about a journalist who pretends to be Jewish to expose anti-Semitism, and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner about a white couple's reaction to their daughter bringing home a black fiancé. After he won the battle, Palm Beach removed the restrictions, and other clubs in the area opened their doors to Jewish and black patrons. The Anti-Defamation League praised him for his actions at the time. And if Trump is a racist now, as president, then he is doing a terrible, terrible job at it, as Trump has absolutely been the best president for blacks since Lincoln by far, and that is not hyperbole. Eisenhower also did a tremendous amount, but if you truly do care about the plights and potentials of the African American community, please listen and consider carefully the following facts. Immediately upon entering office, he prioritized the initiative on historically black colleges and universities by moving it to the White House and appropriating more money to HBCUs than any other president by far. He also established a presidential board of advisors on HBCUs. And President Trump signed the Future Act into law. The law permanently funds HBCUs, tribal colleges and universities, minority-serving institutions, and Hispanic-serving colleges, and also increases funding for STEM programs in those schools. His excellent Opportunity Zone program attracted massive investments and business opportunities to low-income majority African American communities. African American unemployment dropped the lowest in history, significantly lower in fact than it had ever been, and African American wages and salaries went up almost 10% under Trump. And again, the lowest black poverty levels in recorded history, highest black home ownership rates and small business startups, with black-owned businesses increasing more than 400% since Trump took office. President Trump's Labor Department policy put $800 billion into the 401ks of blacks, for which he was publicly thanked by the founder of BET. This year, Trump introduced his Platinum Plan, which involves a litany of projects, actions, and funding allocations designed to improve the African American quality of life, which includes $500 billion annually of infrastructure spending in majority black communities. Trump's administration has also been making headway in achieving school choice reform, a vitally important education and human rights issue for all lower-income Americans, but long recognized by the black community as affecting them profoundly and being a very crucial matter to them. Trump also signed a bill to upgrade Martin Luther King's and Medgar Evers' birthplaces to National Historic Parks and Monuments. and the significance of which cannot be overstated. Trump rolled out the most sweeping criminal justice and prison reform agreements in history, appending the racist and harsh effects of Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden's mandatory minimums and sentencing disparities. Along with loosening restrictions on federal mandatory minimum sentences and extending laws that help federal drug offenders serving disproportionately long sentences, he has also initiated the release of unjustly long incarcerated blacks under the 2018 First Step Act. This act also contains many other positive provisions, such as restricting the use of restraints on pregnant women, expanding compassionate release for terminally ill patients, placing prisoners closer to family in some cases, mandating de-escalation training for correctional officers, improving feminine hygiene in prison. And now the Second Step Act, currently underway, helps recently released inmates rehabilitate and find jobs, among other things. And there are many other bills and executive orders and actions that directly benefit the African American and Native American and Hispanic American populations that I will not go into here, but another time. So once again, if he has some kind of anti-black agenda as a racist, he's failing miserably at that. And so now regarding another minority group, the LGBT community, you might remember in 2016 everyone was frantically screaming that the Trump administration's going to put gays in concentration camps, which to my knowledge has not happened. But they're still arguing that he's taking away their rights somehow, which as far as I've seen, is simply not true. And I think this is reflected in the fact that Hornet, a non-political gay dating website, conducted a poll of 10,000 gay men and found that 45% of them support President Trump and will vote for him. Other polls put the number of gay support for Trump closer to 25%, but assuming it's somewhere in the middle, say 35%, that is millions of LGBT people who will be voting for President Trump. I mean, Trump was the first president to enter the White House supporting gay marriage. He created, spearheaded, and funded the global initiative to legalize homosexuality in the 72 countries where it is still a crime. Trump is also the first president to appoint an openly gay man to a very high-level cabinet position, and he's continuously nominated LGBT people into government, appointing 5 openly gay ambassadors. And he's secured a historic donation of free HIV medication for over 200,000 people. I mean, Trump has always been a New York liberal socialite. Of course he's not anti-gay. During the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, Trump donated very heavily to charities that focused on AIDS and the gay community in general. And to those that think he's a sexist, I just point out that Trump has had more women as top advisors than did Obama, Bush, or Clinton, and within the first year named more women to senior cabinet posts than any other president in history. If his actions were guided by sexism, why would he make such choices? Speaking of misogyny and sexism, let's talk about sexual assault. First off, Tara Reade's rape accusation against Joe Biden is dramatically more credible than anything levied against Trump or Kavanaugh. Tara Reade worked for him. She filed a complaint at the time, told all her family and friends who all believed her. Unlike Christine Blasey Ford, whose best friends don't even believe her, she never told anyone until that nomination. She couldn't remember any details or provide any evidence that they even encountered each other. The details of Reade's allegations are far more extensive than I'll get into here, but suffice it to say they are very, very credible. But the media led a multi-month-long public frenzy over Ford's completely unsubstantiated, incredible accusations while they utterly ignored and actively covered up Tara Reade's infinitely more credible and more serious accusations against the potential next president of the United States. And, Biden is on camera 100 times groping women, adolescents, and little girls highly inappropriately and making them visibly very uncomfortable, while Trump never once has been on video behaving that way, despite being a major celebrity in the public eye for decades. And, that alone, I think, makes this more serious allegation against Biden that much more believable. His reputation for groping and fondling adult women has led to people quitting, avoiding his parties, and 8 public accusations of sexual harassment or inappropriate sexual behavior, not including Tara Reade's accusation of actual penetrative rape. And also, bear in mind that if you look at video of Biden at the time of this alleged incident, he was not the feeble, soft-spoken grandfather figure he portrays himself as today, but was a hot-headed, extremely aggressive person who loved to scream angrily and vindictively. And as far as the sexual assault allegations against Trump, they were all either later admitted to be lies, or they just have zero corroboration and zero evidence, which is not to say that they're, definitively not true, but that's the facts. Now let's move on to the issue of political corruption as well as nepotism. This issue alone, especially with what we know now, honestly makes Biden ineligible for office. Not only is Biden's lifetime of corruption and bribery now being fully exposed with the advent of the Hunter drives, we also know now that Biden is totally compromised by the Chinese Communist Party due to the fact that they not only have footage of embarrassing but also criminal acts of his son, but even more importantly, all the records of the family's corrupt business dealings with CCP-backed criminal enterprises. So he is simply compromised. It is rapidly becoming indisputable that Joe Biden sold his influence as vice president for hundreds of millions of dollars to criminal oligarchs and corrupt government officials in Ukraine, China, Russia, Iraq, Venezuela, and many other countries, all in exchange for altering foreign policy. Trump, on the other hand, has been investigated more than any politician in history. $50 million 3-year Mueller investigation led by rabid Trump haters in the IRS auditing him for years now, combing through his and his family's finances, House Intel committees, the CIA, FBI, investigative reporters, all trying desperately to find dirt on him for years now, and all have found nothing. I mean, it appears that Trump might be the cleanest and least corrupt politician in modern history. Trump and his family may have made some decisions that were of poor optics and therefore perhaps mistakes, but nothing that can be seriously interpreted as having any significant effect financially for the family. And most importantly to understand on this issue is that while the net worth of many politicians mysteriously grow to tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars on a politician's humble salary, Trump's net worth fell by $2.5 billion since becoming president, according to Forbes magazine. I mean, he also immediately attacked the DC swamp system by implementing various very strict lobbying bans on White House officials, which is extremely important with regards to eliminating political corruption. Again, political corruption is just another topic that really needs many hours, if not days, worth of discussion to address fully. But I'll just move on now and address a couple of the major criticisms and concerns over Trump that have not already been addressed. Starting with a very hot one these days, the COVID pandemic response. Blaming Trump for all the deaths is really quite ridiculous when they don't even say how they would do anything different, and when the Democrats and the mainstream news were all downplaying it for the first couple months, saying Trump was overreacting and arguing against the China travel ban as well as the Europe travel ban. And it was the 5 Democrat governors that ordered sick people, including sick young people, into nursing homes among the most vulnerable population, leading to 40% of all U.S. COVID deaths. A truly shocking move, considering that not only did we already know at the time how much worse the disease is for seniors, but we've already known forever that seniors are more vulnerable to flus and respiratory illnesses in general. It was because of Trump that the private sector was able to organize and mobilize so quickly and efficiently in creating PPE and masks and medical equipment. And there was this logjam at first with the testing kits because of all the government regulations involved. But then when Trump lifted that, the private sector got in and rapidly advanced the testing procedures, creating all different choices, way, way quicker, faster tests, way, way cheaper, to the point where, we quickly ended up testing almost as much in this country as all other countries combined. And, Trump gave New York City a converted aircraft carrier and converted the Javits Center into a hospital, which the governor and mayor didn't even use, instead just ordering sick people into nursing homes. Trump helped create medical facilities in many other cities too, which were all also generally not even used. He created the Farmers to Families food program and got the first wave of economic relief out in an extremely impressively timely manner. This topic also obviously requires its own video to flesh out all the details and address all the arguments, but the Trump administration response was generally very good. Even Dr. Birx said early on that if the response was carried out perfectly, we would still see a minimum of 200,000 deaths. And those saying it was all terrible can't really point out what exactly was so supposedly bad or how it could have been better. The only claims I have heard regarding more draconian lockdowns and mask mandates are simply not supported by actual science, nor the continually amassing data being gathered from different states and different nations and how these different approaches compare. It shouldn't be controversial to simply cite science and data, especially when so many lives and livelihoods are at stake, but sadly, in these times, what I just said would make some people furious instead of curious. Oh, and it's also a damn lie that Trump said the virus was a hoax. Even anti-Trump fact-checkers like Politico and Snopes have debunked that lie, but that didn't stop Joe Biden and all the Democrat politicians from constantly repeating that lie over and over, along with the inject yourself with bleach lie, among so many others. So let's just talk about lies. Everyone commonly says, complains about Trump being a liar. The thing about Trump's lies that you see listed, like, oh, here's a list of 2 billion lies that he's told. You look at them and it's mostly just, hyperbole and exaggeration. Like, he'll say something like, nobody knows more about golf than me, which, will be fact-checked and is saying, actually, this individual does know more. Or he'll say something like, there were 40,000 people at the rally when there was actually only 25,000 at that one. So again, it's just mostly hyperbole, which is recognized as such by most people with simple common sense. All those kinds of lies and exaggerations generally don't mislead people in any serious way regarding the most significant matters of policy and record. On the other hand, the lies told by Biden and other top Democrats, and especially the mainstream media, however, are incredibly divisive and incendiary. such as claiming that the president said white supremacists are very fine people when he actually said they should be condemned totally. If you have fallen for that lie and still believe it to be true, please just look up very fine people hoax online to see the actual unedited video or read the transcript. Biden's lies, far more than Trump's, are also severely misleading over extremely important matters, such as his platform for energy policy and economic policies or gun control, to name a few. Biden has actually had a reputation for being a liar as a politician for the past 50 years. He was failed in law school for plagiarizing. He had to drop out of his first presidential run for plagiarizing, and he even plagiarized parts of his Democrat nomination acceptance speech this past year. Biden has said he graduated in the top half of his class when in fact he graduated in the bottom 10%. He claimed to have 3 degrees when he only had 1. He repeatedly lied about marching in the civil rights movement to gain black votes. He never marched. He lied about being arrested in South Africa while visiting Nelson Mandela, also just to get black votes. He recently lied in an interview saying the NAACP endorsed him every time he ran for office, also to get black votes. The NAACP has never endorsed any candidates. He was called out years ago for claiming to be the first in his family to go to college when there were many among his family who had before him, and yet he still repeated this falsehood even just this year on the campaign trail. But he has been telling far more serious and harmful lies recently, generating unnecessary hatred, division, fear, and influencing people's political and electoral choices through flagrant dishonesty. He opened his campaign on the very fine people hoax and has constantly repeated it over and over during his campaign and in his campaign attack ads. Still repeating it even just yesterday in a speech along with Kamala, who also repeated it yesterday. Just a few days before the election and 3 years after the lie was spread and immediately debunked, with the video and transcript being freely available. Biden also keeps repeating the lie that Trump never denounced white supremacy. Also repeating it again, just yesterday he said it. Low information voters will believe this despicable, defamatory lie, while informed voters will have seen any of the dozens of compilation videos of President Trump very strongly denouncing white supremacy and racism at least 48 times over the past 5 years. So again, it's a total blatant lie that's so easily disprovable with a simple YouTube search, but they're depending on those who don't take the effort to question or do their own research. Biden has aired campaign ads on television to millions repeating these lies, as well as the lie that Trump called fallen military heroes suckers and losers. No president or politician has expressed as much love and admiration and dedication to military servicemen and women than Donald Trump, and I could show you endless montages of actions and behaviors showing that as an absolute fact. Biden himself actually did disrespect soldiers by calling them stupid bastards to their faces, and that is on tape. Biden's campaign attack ads are just filled to the brim with these and many other lies about Trump and his administration. Claiming Trump did not give tax breaks to working families, objectively false. Claiming Trump attacked health care for patients with pre-existing conditions, objectively false. Locking kids in cages, that was Obama and Joe Biden, not Trump. And so many more demonstrably false statements he crams into his TV spots and fills his speeches with. He also lies about his own positions by flip-flopping on important issues like police funding and fracking. And as mentioned, Biden keeps repeating the lie that Trump said the virus is a hoax, as well as the inject yourself with bleach lie, and many other flagrant, provable lies that paint a picture of a monster in the minds of millions of Americans. He repeated the utterly absurd and bonkers conspiracy theory that Trump was having postal trucks and mailboxes towed away to suppress mail-in voting. He straight up lied to the American people during the debates about not getting money from foreign governments. And Biden also said during the debates that not one single person with private insurance lost their plan under Obamacare, when more than 6 million Americans had their individual health care plans canceled when Obamacare took effect. On the subject of lies, I also need to mention the lies about Trump created and perpetuated by the mainstream corporate media, because so many millions are still completely believing these easily disprovable falsehoods and base so much of their opinions upon them. I mentioned the virus is a hoax lie, and the inject yourself with bleach lie, and the very fine people hoax, and the never denounced white supremacy lie, and calling the troops suckers and losers lie, and there are so many others told by the media about Trump, literally thousands and thousands. But another big one I see people bring up all the time is the mocking disabled reporter hoax. Trump didn't even know the guy was disabled, and he's on camera many, many times making this exact same gesture while mocking others. Even in the same exact speech, he made the gesture again later to mock a retired general who was not disabled. And the disabled reporter has an immobile arm, not arms that flail about like Trump was doing. And you can find many, many videos and photographs of Trump honoring and hugging people with disabilities and them honoring and hugging him. Trump didn't mock a reporter's disability. It's just another smear attempt. If you're still unsure about that, just go and find some of the many videos out there debunking this silly lie. And of course we have other massive lies like the Russia collusion hoax, which despite being disproved by the Mueller team, people still bring it up as if it were true. And there's about another 200 seriously defamatory major lies and about 2,000 more minor silly lies, all spread by the media and Democrat politicians. You know, the mainstream news media has always engaged in spin and deflection and lies by omission, but it's truly remarkable and astonishing how in recent years they have just bombarded the public with full-on, flagrant, blatant lies and fabrications that are often the exact literal opposite of reality. Another popular lie, of course, is the idea that Trump put kids in cages at the border, which is not true. But the matter of migrant family separation is a real issue that does deserve attention. The photos of the kids in what appear to be cages were all from the Obama-Biden administration, not Trump's. Trump immediately improved the facilities dramatically. And with regards to separation itself, estimates are that about an entire third of the children being taken across the border are being trafficked. DNA tests have shown this, that those claiming to be their parents or uncles are not actually related. Renting, purchasing, or kidnapping children was commonly used as a free pass into the country in case they got caught due to the catch and release policies, but thanks to the stricter enforcement, that practice has declined dramatically. And consider this, migrant child detention rates dropped from 100,000 children in 2016 under Obama to 15,000 in 2018 under Trump, and has continued to decrease. Those trying to pull on heartstrings by using this argument are essentially saying that trafficked kids should be kept with their captors, many of whom are sexually abusing them, or even suggesting they be released into the country along with their captors. 80% of women and girls crossing the border are raped, according to Huffington Post and others. Those trying to make this argument accuse migration control supporters of being heartless, but it is them who are essentially supporting or at least ignoring rape, kidnapping, and child trafficking. We need rationality and reason when trying to discuss a problem that is not easy to solve perfectly. Now, Trump's personality is another major issue for people, and one that I would actually like to make an individual video about to properly address. But for now, I'll just say a few things. You know, if you actually look at it, he really only insults those who attack him personally and or lie about him or attack the American people in general. Whereas Biden goes around insulting American citizens and potential voters, calling them full of shit, fat, ugly, and a long list of insults and confrontational words. And regarding Trump being a mean guy, like, the mainstream media will always show you the same three pictures of his face scowling, so people think he's just a mean person. He actually has decades of documented random acts of kindness, giving major gifts, surprise donations, and various forms of assistance to people who were not asking. And mostly he didn't do them in front of cameras, or they were not made public until many years later. So one can't just say it was all for publicity. There are various articles and websites and videos dedicated to elaborating a couple dozen of the more notable random acts of kindness and generosity that you can find online. I encourage you to, if this sounds shocking to you, search on BitChute.com for a video titled "Trump Does the Unthinkable" by Liz Crocken to learn, to see some more about this subject. And also go to thegivingtrump.com to see a very long list of all the charities that Trump has been donating to over the decades, and to see what issues he cares about. And don't forget, Trump ran 7 seasons of The Celebrity Apprentice, which was the most popular reality TV show in the world, and one of the most popular shows, period, that was entirely based on raising money for charities and showcasing these charities to the world. Tens of millions of dollars were raised for many dozens of beautiful charities, and hundreds of millions were raised as a direct result of the exposure they gained from the show. And Trump himself, during various episodes, was always doling out these $10, $20, $100,000 donations, when they were unsolicited and he didn't have to, wasn't part of the show. I mean, the guy's supposed to be such a horrible human being. But again, it's his show that he created, and it was the most successful show on TV, and it was entirely based around and showcasing and elevating charities. So there's that. Another thing undecided voters should really consider is the totally unprecedented amount of enthusiasm and love for this president. You have these huge truck and car caravans spanning dozens and dozens of miles occurring across the country in many deeply Democrat counties. The recent weekly Trump caravan in Miami reached 55,000 cars and an estimated 275,000 people participating, mostly Cuban Americans. You have these massive boat flotillas occurring almost every other day, also in blue areas and states. Giant parades and colorful rallies happening in the middle of Los Angeles, Beverly Hills and San Francisco and New York City and other leftist strongholds. Thousands and thousands of Orthodox Jews dancing in the streets of Brooklyn with Trump flags, and also organizing car caravans. For the first time ever, the Amish have collectively voiced support for a presidential candidate, making their own horse and buggy Trump caravans. You've got tons and tons of music videos and all kinds of diverse genres. And, Trump holding 3 rallies a day, actually 5 rallies a day in these days leading up to the election, each one filled with tens of thousands of people dancing, smiling, and celebrating. Actually, yesterday's rally in Pennsylvania had 58,000 people attend. And the average, there's always like 25% of the attendees are registered Democrats. And some of these more recent rallies, too, only 45% were registered Republicans, with the majority being mostly registered Democrats as well as independents. And, these rallies, despite what you've heard, have always been absolute love fests. And whenever a leftist Democrat decides to attend one, worried they might be filled with hate and racism, they're always shocked at how welcoming, loving, accepting, patient, and tolerant all of the rally attendees are. And the rallies pretty much always reflect the demographics of the local area they're held in. So like if a rally's held in a 60% Hispanic county, then 60% of the attendees tend to be Hispanic. And, at every rally for the months leading up to this election, one of the chants is, "We love you, we love you." And every one of these rallies gets an additional 200 to 600,000 online views. None of this has ever happened for another president or presidential candidate. There has never been this much enthusiasm or outpouring of love for an American politician. And they're all celebrating freedom, not oppression, not tyranny, but freedom from those very things. And one last issue that is worth taking into account, because this really transcends party lines and partisan lines, and that's the issue of human and child sex trafficking. While there have been some fake graphs floating around the internet showing that arrests of human traffickers quadrupled in Trump's first year in office, which is not actually true, it is an absolute fact that Trump has done more to combat human trafficking than any previous administration by far, enacting way more legislation and allocating far more funding and creating new governmental positions and departments focusing on the matter. Again, another important topic I'd like to elaborate in its own video to list all of the incredible legislation and actions taken to combat this epidemic of modern-day slavery. The overall list of amazing and beautiful accomplishments of this Trump administration that appeal to all sides of the spectrum is huge. From the Music Modernization Act to the Artificial Intelligence Executive Order to creating the much-needed Space Force to Executive Order on strengthening child welfare system for America's children to finally following through moving the Israel embassy to Jerusalem, which every previous president promised but never delivered. And he also did it for less than 0.5% of the projected cost. And just hundreds and hundreds of other universally great things. If you haven't already, please just search for a list of Trump accomplishments or go to 140reasons.com, 140reasons.com, and see for yourself all the historic accomplishments that really anyone, no matter what side of the political spectrum one is on, should find really wonderful, or at least incredibly impressive. Okay, so if you listened all the way through, thank you so much. Please share with anyone who hasn't voted yet and may be open-minded enough to listen to this information. And if you already voted but are now regretting your decision, find out if you live in one of the dozen or so states that allow you to change your vote before Election Day. Search, how to change my vote plus the state you live in. And, of course, please give this video a like. That would be very helpful to me. And subscribe to my channel as well, since this is my first upload and I have a lot of future content that I'd like to start creating here. Making content does take time though, so if you'd like to encourage me to do more, check out some links in the description to support making more content. I'll also be uploading to multiple platforms, and I'll add those in the description as well once as I set them up. Thanks everybody. Peace.